So as we get started today, I want to remind you that next Tuesday there will not be a class due to the annual Bible lectureship, which we'll be using all the classrooms in the Bible building. However, next week there is a video assignment on Blackboard that requires you to watch a documentary. It's actually part one of a documentary on Mormonism. There will be questions on Mormonism on the third exam, but make sure to complete that. I'll say more about it on Thursday as a reminder, but don't forget, keep that in the back of your mind that you need to complete that next week. It does count towards your grade. The information, again, is on Blackboard, but I'll say more about it on Thursday. We continue today with looking at a variety of religions that have developed in India. And any religion that develops in India, or that has developed in India, has to come out of, in a sense, Hinduism. It's heavily shaped by the Hindu context. But as we'll see, even some other religions have been influential there as well. The two that we're looking at today are much smaller compared to the two major ones, Hinduism and Buddhism. But there's still some important aspects out of these religions. And even Sikhism, for example, is larger than Judaism. There are more Sikhs in the world than there are Jews. So let's start off with Jainism. Jainism, it's hard to pin down exactly its origins. Maybe around the time of the development of the Upanishads, maybe slightly before. One of the major figures that we'll talk about here in a little bit lived around the same time as the Buddha, which we'll talk about next week. But there are some important concepts to start off with. First of all is the principle of Ahimsa. Probably best understood, best translated as nonviolence. The idea behind Ahimsa is maintaining or abstaining from any sort of violence against any form of life. For Jains, the idea is that any sort of violence leaves a stain on your soul. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so the concept of living a life of nonviolence is one in which you are, it's not just about not fighting. It includes your diet, it includes your schedule, your travel, your choice of career. This commitment would be abstaining from physical violence, as well as any sort of spiritual or emotional violence, or even violence against the environment. And so many Jains would be vegetarians. Now, there is, of course, a little bit of a tension or almost a paradox, because total nonviolence, even within the ideology of Jainism, is impossible. We cannot perform any action without causing some sort of harm to something, right? To even things that we cannot see, right? And so there's a question here of balance, right? And so you want to do as little harm as possible. The term Jain means something like followers of the victorious one. It refers to following after certain teachers who are called Jinas or victors. And as we'll see, there are some places where there are quite a bit of similarities between Jains and Hindus. In fact, many Jains do not have a problem with being referred to as Hindu. There's a lot of, we talk about karma, samsara, very similar in both of these groups. But the key thing, of course, is often the differences in these practices. One brief word about the symbol on this picture. A couple things there. On the open palm here at the bottom is the symbol for Ahimsa. So the symbol for nonviolence. The swastika, in this case, represents the wheel of samsara, that constantly turning wheel. Others suggest that it represents the 4 different types of beings that Jains believe exist in the universe. We'll talk about more of them later. The 3 dots above the swastika represent the ideals of insight, knowledge, and conduct. And then finally, the dot above the crescent shape represents the soul who has escaped samsara, the liberated soul. And then the boundary, the outside shape, is the Jain conception of how the universe looks, the shape of the universe. As I mentioned, it's really difficult to talk about the origins of Jainism. There seems to be some indication of at least the proto-Jainism as far back as the 9th century before Christ. However, the major individual who helped shape the form of more modern Jainism was a man named Vardhamana. Vardhamana was his given name, often referred to as Mahavira, which means the great hero. Right? So it's kind of a nickname or an appellation rather than any sort of given name. Mahavira is believed to have been the most recent in a series of holy people throughout many ages. These teachers are referred to as Jina or Tirthankara. Tirthankara, the idea probably translates into something like a ford maker or a bridge builder. This is someone who builds a bridge or creates a place to ford a river so others can cross. They are builders of bridges across samsara, across this ocean of birth and death. Supposedly these teachers have appeared throughout history at various points when they were needed to guide people with the same types of principles. So every so often these people will appear, these Tirthankaras, often the same kind of principles, but Mahavira being the most recent. Mahavira, as I mentioned, lived around the time of the Buddha, around the 500s BC, was of the Kshatriya clan within Indian society, so fairly high up in the caste system. But he too, like the Buddha, decided to renounce his position to experience liberation. Ultimately, the conception of these Jina, including Mahavira, is that the Jina could have been a benevolent ruler. And he's kind of tasked with the abilities and could have been given the opportunities to be in charge, but they renounce all of that. They give that up so they can help other people, so they can experience liberation. There are a lot of different stories about his life depending on which type of Jainism you're talking about. Some claim that he had a wife and a daughter prior to his renunciation of life. Others claim he was never married. But at some point in his life, according to these traditions, and one that is common to all, is that he's decided to achieve liberation. That's what he wants to do, and it takes him 12 years to do it. Again, there's some lack of clarity here, lack of clear things. Some people argue that, or claim that he renounced everything, including clothing. And that was kind of a sign of his detachment from modesty and shame. And so he focused for 12 years on fasting, on meditation, some claiming he even did not speak for those 12 years until he experienced enlightenment. Here too, what happens after his enlightenment? Well, some claim that he focused on ceasing all activity. He did not eat, he did not sleep, and spent the next 30 years in a hall where all he muttered was the sacred sound Om, and his followers recorded these teachings that he is kind of muttering. Others claim that no, he went around and was sharing these teachings with others, and so there's a lot of difference here about what happened after he experienced liberation. There are, however, 5 life events that are considered representative of all Jainas and are celebrated by Jains throughout the year, so important holidays. Mahavir's conception, his birth, his renunciation, his enlightenment, and then his final release from life. These are represented in Jain art, in rituals, in temples. And so these are associated with a lot of traditions about Vardhamana's birth. His mother had visions that her son was going to be a great teacher. At his renunciation, he supposedly pulled out all of the hair on his head. Both groups claim that he achieved the final release at the age of 72. Which they celebrate on the new moon that comes between usually October 15th and November 14th, which is the same day as Diwali in Hinduism. Out of Mahavir's teachings, two major groups develop. Now there are subgroups within this. There are three types of Shvetambara and two types of Digambara. And each of those is divided over some things like worshiping idols and other issues, but I want to just focus on the two major groups. The one is the Digambara, which translates to something like sky-clad, or clad in the sky, and Shvetambara, which means white-clad. Supposedly the division dates to the 4th century BC, when a council is held to regulate what would be considered official Jain doctrine. Right? What is the official teaching of Jainism? And so they need to reach this agreement, fail to have this agreement. There's a famine that comes by, the group kind of splits in north and south. And when they get back together after the famine, they find that the other group has made some changes. There are a couple of things that mark differences between the two groups. One is the question of what texts are to be considered scripture. There are some books that are considered to be scripture, and then there are a large body of other texts in Jainism that are important as well. It's believed that there was a series of scriptures that did exist at one point in antiquity but has been lost. And so they both believe that these texts were lost. But there's differences between these groups about what are the most important texts. Cordelon talks about some of those things, and so I'd refer you to him on that. But one of the things that's important within Jainism is the emphasis on studying Scripture under the guidance of a teacher. Believing that if you just go as an individual reader and try to read these yourself and interpret them, you're going to misinterpret them. So you need to be guided. Within both the Digambara and Shvetambara groups, there are 4 different categories of people, or 4 different turfas. The word here means, of course, a ford, a crossing of a river. Right, so the idea of somebody crossing a river. The 4 turfas are monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. Now, as you might expect from some of the stuff we've already talked about with India, more privileges are accorded men than women, both among the monastics, monks and nuns, and among the common people, the laymen and women. It is believed, however, that you have to take on the monastic life in order to achieve liberation. But between the Digambara and the Shvetambara are some differences about, especially when it comes to women. The Shvetambara Jains believe that women can be ordained to the monastic life and believe that women can achieve enlightenment like men. Now, the Digambaras will ordain women. You can be a nun, but they believe that women are not pure enough, or cannot become pure enough to rise to the highest heavens. And so the only opportunity for a woman in the Digambara Jains is to be reborn as a man. That's the only way you can be considered to achieve liberation. And part of that has to do with another component of the differences, and that's the question of clothing. As suggested by their names, sky-clad and white-clad, they have two different approaches to clothing. Now, predominantly, this is among Jains in India and predominantly the monastics. And this is not a general practice, but the Digambara are clad in the sky, meaning they don't wear clothes. While Shvetambara will wear white clothing. You can understand why I only have pictures of Shvetambara Jains on the slide. Well, the belief is, with the Digambaras, right, so the Digambaras don't wear clothes, they renounce clothes. Well, they will not allow women to renounce clothes, and so women cannot achieve liberation because they can't renounce their clothing. They don't see themselves, however, as going around naked. Now again, this is predominantly in monastics, right? So it's not all Jains. They see themselves with the environment as their clothing. Again, as an outsider, of course, you have to say, you're naked. But the conception is, right, you're clad in the skies. And so that difference. The idea behind the white clothing is its simplicity. Right? So wearing white clothing is not going to be a hindrance to achieve liberation. So you're renouncing some clothing, but you're just taking on some others. You can even see, you might not be able to make it out, but many of the monks and nuns among the Tibetan also wear masks, with the idea being that it's trying to prevent you from swallowing flies or whatever, right? And so the reason you do that is so you prevent any sort of insects or something like that doing harm unintentionally, right? Flying in your mouth, getting swallowed, and dying. Any religion developing in India or any religion going to India in a missionary type way must always deal with the caste system. And it's just a facet of Hindu life that you either accept it or you reject it or you respond to it. And we'll see Buddhism respond to it in different ways, but the caste system has been such an important part of Indian life that religions must deal with it. Within Jainism, the understanding of the caste system is kind of complicated. Mahavira taught that liberation could be achieved across the castes, and that anybody in any of the caste systems could achieve liberation. But there still is, especially within the Jain community in India, differences among caste lines. And so, there's still that social division, but there's still on the other hand, there's the ideology that somebody in the lower castes can achieve liberation. And the caste system is even so important that it doesn't really disturb intermarriage. For example, Jains and Hindus can marry across together as long as they're within the same caste. Questions about the two types? Anything to...
Well, that's just an inquiry, but say a Jain and a Hindu were to marry, would that be like us marrying a completely other religion, or would that be like somebody from the Baptist church marrying somebody from the Methodist church?
It would probably be considered more of the kind of interdenominational one. It wouldn't be like a Christian marrying a Jew or something like that. There's enough similarity there, especially from the Jainism side. So it wouldn't be as much as long as they were at the same social level. That would be the bigger concern.
Do they worship the same God?
We'll talk a little bit more here about some of the things related to the gods, but there would be some overlap. Different conceptions, though. about the couples, but there would be some overlap.
Is there punishment for violence?
Yes, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Yeah.